In the spring of 1993, every cattle rancher in Blaine County, Montana, had an opinion about what Della Corwin was doing to her pasture, and not a single one of them thought it was smart. They said it at Heckman's Feed and Supply on the east side of Harlem, where the ranchers gathered on Saturday mornings to drink bad coffee out of styrofoam cups and argue about the weather and the price of feeder calves. They said it at the High Line livestock auction in Chinook, where the auctioneers had been calling the same family's brands for 3 generations. They said it in the parking lot of the First Lutheran Church on Sunday afternoons, speaking quietly so the women inside finishing the potluck wouldn't hear, which was unnecessary because the women inside already knew. The Corwin woman was digging up 4 acres of her best bottomland grass and planting something nobody in Blaine County had ever planted on purpose. She was planting elderberry. 500 a dry July, 500 elderberry cuttings, to be exact, in 2 long rows along the south bank of the Milk River, where it curved through the northwest corner of her family's property. She had ordered them from a nursery in Missouri that specialized in native shrubs, paid $340 for the lot, driven them home in the back of her 1988 Ford pickup, and set them in the ground herself, with a dibble bar she'd borrowed from her neighbor Theron Purcell. Before Theron had time to ask why she needed it, she planted alone. For the first 4 days, with her daughter, Wren, age 11, handing her cuttings from the cardboard shipping boxes one by one. She planted with her father-in-law Amos, sitting on an overturned 5-gallon bucket at the end of the row, watching. Nobody else helped. Nobody else offered. The joke started the way jokes always start in small counties. Theron Purcell told his wife. His wife told her sister. Her sister's husband mentioned it at Heckman's. By the second Saturday, in April, every rancher within 20 miles of the Corwin place had heard that Della Corwin was turning her river pasture into a berry patch. By the end of April, someone had started calling it Della's Garden, and the name had stuck, with the particular cruelty of nicknames that are meant to diminish. Della was 41 years old in the spring of 1993. She had been running the Corwin family cattle operation alone for 2 years, since her husband, Marcus, had died of a heart attack in February of 1991 at age 44. On a Tuesday morning in the calving barn, with a newborn heifer calf half delivered and 3 inches of snow coming down outside. Della had finished the calving herself. She had called the funeral home from the barn phone. She had put the calf in a warming box and gone into the house and told her children. Wren had been 9, her son Cody. She had named him after no one in particular. It was simply a name Marcus had loved. Had been 14. The Corwin cattle operation ran 180 head of commercial Angus to 20,200 acres of deeded and leased ground along the Milk River drainage. It had been Marcus's grandfather's operation before it was Marcus's father, Amos's, and before it was Marcus's, and Marcus had planned for it to be their son Cody's after him. The plan had not included Marcus dying at 44, or Della running the whole of it alone, or the cattle market entering the worst sustained downturn since the 1980s farm crisis. At approximately the same moment, she became the only adult in the family capable of making a decision. She had run the operation. She had kept it, running through 1991 and 1992 by cutting every cost that could be cut, and by refusing to sell any breeding stock at the bottom of the market, which is the thing that separates the ranchers who survive a downturn from the ones who don't. Cody had been 14 when his father died, and 16 by the end of 1992, and he had become, in those 2 years, the kind of young man who does not require asking twice. He was up before Della in the mornings. He had taken over the winter feeding route without comment. He had learned to read a hay test and a cattle condition gore and a lease agreement before he learned to drive. Wren was different. Wren was the one who still cried at the kitchen table some evenings when she thought no one was looking. She was the one who had planted a small garden beside the south fence the summer after Marcus died, mostly marigolds and one struggling tomato plant, and who had named each marigold after a different color that Marcus had liked. Wren was the one who kept the laughter in the house even when there wasn't much to laugh about. She was 11 years old, and she had decided, somewhere inside herself, that someone in the family needed to find things funny, and she had taken the job permanently. The elderberry idea had not come from nowhere. It had come from a woman named Dr. Pamela Ossie, a small-scale agroforestry researcher from the University of Minnesota Extension, who had driven into Blaine County in September of 1992 as part of a survey of native plant integration possibilities in northern Great Plains cattle operations. She had knocked on Della's door on a Wednesday afternoon with a clipboard and a research proposal and a thermos of coffee she had made herself that morning in a motel room in Havre. Della had let her in. She did not know why, exactly. She had turned away extension agents before. She had turned away a crop insurance salesman and a range specialist from the NRCS and a man from a grazing cooperative in Lewistown who had driven 4 hours to tell her she should be rotational grazing her river pasture in smaller paddocks. She had turned them all away politely and with finality. She let Ossie in because Dr. Ossie had not come to tell her anything. She had come to ask. They sat at the kitchen table for 3 hours. Dr. Ossie had been studying the integration of native shrubs into cattle operations in the northern plains for 11 years. She had been looking specifically at elderberry, Sambucus canadensis, the American black elderberry, which was native to the Milk River drainage and had grown wild along the river breaks for 10,000 years before European settlement. Because elderberry had properties that no extension program had yet seriously quantified. It stabilized stream banks. It provided summer shade and wind reduction in riparian pasture. It fixed nitrogen at the root level, and its berries, which ripened in September, were among the highest antioxidant fruits grown in North America and had been used as medicine by every Plains tribe and every European immigrant community that had settled the region. The health food market for elderberry, Dr. Ossie said carefully, was in its early stages. The demand was coming from urban consumers in Minneapolis, Chicago, Seattle, and the East Coast cities, who had begun buying elderberry syrup, elderberry extract, and dried elderberry for immune support. The supply was almost entirely imported from Austria and Poland. There was no significant domestic American production, because no one had thought to grow it commercially in the regions where it grew best, which were the river drainages of the northern plains and upper Midwest. Della had asked 4 questions during that 3 hours. She had written the answers in a spiral notebook she kept on the kitchen counter for farm notes. She had asked about establishment time. She had asked about harvest methods. She had asked about whether cattle would browse the shrubs before they were established, and she had asked for Dr. Ossie's phone number at the university. Dr. Ossie had given her all 4 things. She had also left behind a box of research bulletins and a single peer-reviewed paper she had published the previous year in a journal called Agroforestry Systems that described a small pilot planting of elderberry along a creek bank in western Minnesota and its effects on adjacent pasture production over 5 years. Della had read the paper twice that evening after the children were in bed. She had read it a 3rd time in the morning. She had not told anyone about Dr. Ossie or the paper for 2 months. In November of 1992, she had run the numbers on the kitchen table the same way she ran every set of numbers, carefully, twice, in pencil, with the farm ledger open beside her. The numbers were what they were. The cattle operation was covering its operating costs and her family's living expenses. But it was not covering capital depreciation, and the river pasture along the milk will make calfures producing below its potential because the stream bank erosion that had been accelerating since the 1970s had taken out 40 feet of productive ground in the past decade and was still moving. She needed something to stop the erosion. She needed something to reduce the summer heat stress that was cutting her August milk weights on the cows nursing calves. She needed something the other operations in Blaine County did not have. She ordered the elderberry cuttings in February of 1993. Amos had found out the morning they arrived, when he walked into the mudroom of the main house and found 40 cardboard boxes stacked from floor to ceiling with green shipping tape and Missouri postmarks. He stood in the doorway. He was 73 years old. He had ranched this ground for 51 years. He had sold the operation to Marcus in 1984 when his knees had given out, and he had moved into the small house at the back of the property and watched Marcus run it ever since. And now watched Della run it, with the quiet attention of a man who had learned late in life that watching is more useful than advising. He came into the kitchen. Della was making breakfast. Amos. Della, there are boxes in the mudroom. There are. A lot of boxes. 500 elderberry cuttings. He sat down. He drank his coffee. He looked at the wall for a moment, the way old men look at walls when they are thinking about something they're not sure they should say. Della, I'm going to ask you one thing. Go ahead. The woman from the university, the one who came in September, she suggested this. She provided the research. The decision is mine. He nodded. He drank his coffee. Your mother's family, he said, the Hesters, up in the Bear Paws. They kept a stand of elderberry along their creek pasture going back to the 20s. Your mother's mother made elderberry jelly every September. Sold it at the Chinook Fair for 30 years. I used to think that was just something old women did with whatever grew along the creek. I have not thought about that in a long time until you put those boxes in the mudroom this morning. Della had not known that. Her mother had died when Della was 6. She had grown up, knowing almost nothing about the Hester family's way of managing their land. Amos, she said. I am not going to argue with you, he said. But you should know that the people who are going to laugh at you have grandmothers who did the same thing you're doing, and they have forgotten. He walked back to his house. Della finished the eggs. She told Wren to get her work gloves. The first real laugh came on a Saturday afternoon in early May, when Theron Purcell stopped his truck on the county road and watched Della and Wren setting cuttings along the riverbank for 20 minutes before he turned into the drive. He was a decent man, Theron. The dry July. He had helped Della move cattle in the fall of 1991, when she didn't have enough riders, and he had left hay at her gate once in the hard winter of 1992. Without saying it was from him, though she had known, he would not have laughed in her driveway. He was the kind of man who did not do that, but he had asked his wife about it that same evening, and his wife had mentioned it at the Lutheran Ladies' Circle on Thursday. And by Saturday of the following week, the county road past the Corwin place had seen more slow-moving pickups than it normally saw in a month. The name that stuck was not Della's Garden anymore. By June, people had started calling it the Berry Patch, with the particular inflection that makes 2 ordinary words into a dismissal. A rancher named Phil Eckerd, who ran 300 head on the benchland north of Harlem, and who had twice tried to lease Della's river ground after Marcus died and been politely refused, had told someone at the auction barn that Della Corwin had lost her head and was going to lose her ranch on top of it. The story had traveled from there. July. A woman named Arlene Voigt, who had been the county extension chair for 12 years and who had known the Corwin family since before Marcus was born, drove out to the ranch on a Wednesday afternoon in June and sat on the porch and drank iced tea and did not say what she had come to say for 45 minutes. Finally, she said it. "Della, there is talk. I know there is. People are saying you've gone down a road that doesn't lead anywhere. The road I was on, Arlene, was leading off a cliff by 1999. I've run the numbers. The cattle market isn't coming back to where it was. The river pasture is losing ground to erosion every year. I needed a second income. I needed something to stabilize the bank. The elderberry does both of those things." Arlene looked at her iced tea. "People are also saying, and I'm only telling you because someone should, that they're worried about you, about whether you're making clear decisions. Since Marcus." Della was quiet for a moment. She had expected this. She had been expecting it since April. "Arlene," she said, "I have been making clear decisions since the morning I called the funeral home from the calving barn and finished delivering the heifer calf and went inside and told my children their father wasn't coming in for supper. I understand that some people find it easier to attribute my decisions to grief than to logic. I'd appreciate it if you'd tell them the logic is sound and let them draw their own conclusions." Arlene Voigt did not have an answer to that. She finished her tea. She left. She did not, in the next 4 years, ever question Della's judgment to her face again, though she also did not stop hearing about it from the people who continued to doubt. Della planted the last of the 500 cuttings in the 3rd week of May. She had lost 61 in the first 3 weeks to a late frost and one stretch of high water that had lifted a section of the lower row and deposited it 50 yards downstream. She and Cody had spent a full Saturday retrieving what they could. They had replanted 43 of the 61. The remaining 18 were gone. By July, the survivors were throwing new growth, thin green shoots reaching toward the river light at a rate that surprised even Della, who had been told to expect slow establishment. Dr. Ossie had explained this on the phone in March. Elderberry was not slow. It was simply invisible in its first year. It was building roots. The crown development came after. Cody had noticed the new growth first. He was 16, and he had the eyes of someone who had learned to read landscape the way other people read text. "Mom." She had come to stand beside him at the fence. "The ones down at the water's edge," he said. "Look at the stems." She looked. The stems of the surviving cuttings near the waterline were thicker than she'd expected. They had the dull red color that elderberry bark carries in its first year of true establishment. "They're taking," she said. He didn't say anything for a moment. "Dad would have liked this," he said finally. She didn't answer. She put her hand on the top fence wire and looked at the river and let the moment be what it was. The summer of 1993 was dry. The Milk River ran low, which was not unusual for a drought year in northern Montana, and the bottomland grass on the river pasture came in sparse. Della moved the cattle off the river pasture a month earlier than usual and started feeding hay in August, which was 2 months early, and cost her $2,800 she had not planned to spend. She wrote the number in the farm ledger. She wrote it in a column she had labeled Reasons beside the elderberry planting costs. By the fall of 1993, the surviving elderberry had reached an average height of 3 feet. The canes were not yet producing. Dr. Ossie had told her not to expect fruit until year 3 at the earliest. Della was not watching for fruit. She was watching the stream bank. The bank at the north end of the elderberry planting had by October stopped moving. She could see it when she walked the fence line. The root mass that the elderberry had pushed into the bank face over the summer had begun to knit the soil together in a way that the native grasses, which had been retreating from the bank edge for a decade, had not managed. She took photographs. She sent them to Dr. Osi. Dr. Osi called her from Minneapolis. Della, the root mass is exactly what I expected. By year 3, you'll have 60 to 80% bank stabilization along the planted section. You're going to lose that erosion problem. What about the pasture ground behind it? Once the bank holds, the sediment deposits upstream will rebuild. You could gain back 8 to 12 feet of productive pasture in 5 to 7 years. Della wrote that down. She did not tell anyone about the bank stabilization. She wrote it in the composition notebook she had started keeping in the spring of 1993, alongside the soil moisture readings and the cattle weights and the elderberry growth measurements she took every other week from the 2 marker canes she had flagged with orange ribbon at the midpoint of each row. She kept the notebook in the kitchen drawer. The neighbor had stopped mentioning the berry patch by the end of 1993. The mockery had a half-life. Once the elderberry failed to produce any dramatic results, good or bad, in its first growing season, people lost interest in either the laugh or the argument. What replaced the mockery was silence, the particular watchful silence of a small community waiting to see whether it had been right to doubt. Della was in her 3rd year of running the operation alone. She was managing well. She was not managing easily. There was nothing easy about carrying 2,200 acres and 180 head and 2 children and an aging father-in-law and a set of banknotes that required her to be right about the cattle market every single year. But she was managing, and the community had begun by 1994 to understand that whatever else might be said about Della Corwin, she was not going to fold. The first fruit came in September of 1995. The elderberry canes along the south bank had reached their 3rd summer. The fruit clusters, heavy, deep purple-black, hanging in the flat-topped formations that botanists call corymbs, had appeared in August and had ripened through the first 2 weeks of September. Della picked a single cluster on the morning of September 8th and brought it into the kitchen. She set it on the counter. She called Wren. Wren was 13. She looked at the cluster for a moment. She ate 1 berry. She made a face. It's sour. It's supposed to be sour. What do we do with it? We process it. We sell it. To who? Della had been working on that question for 6 months. Dr. Osi had given her 3 contacts in the spring of 1995. A woman who ran a small specialty food distributor in Minneapolis, a co-op buyer in Seattle who was sourcing native fruits for the natural food market, and an herbalist in Missoula named Gwen Lacefield, who had been making elderberry tinctures for sale in health food stores, and had been complaining publicly in herb grower newsletters for years about the impossibility of finding a reliable domestic source of fresh American elderberry. Della called Gwen Lacefield first. She called her on a Tuesday morning in early June of 1995 from the kitchen phone while the breakfast dishes soaked in the sink in the glint. Gwen Lacefield answered on the 2nd ring. Della introduced herself. She explained the planting. She explained the expected yield. She asked if Gwen was still interested in a domestic source. There was a pause. Mrs. Corwin, Gwen Lacefield said, I have been trying to find a domestic source of Sambucus canadensis for 9 years. Every person I have contacted has either been growing too little to matter or is 3 years away from their first harvest. How large is your planting? 439 surviving shrubs. 2nd-year plants this spring. I'm expecting between 300 and 600 pounds of fresh fruit in September. Another pause, longer this time. What price are you expecting? Della told her the number she had calculated. $4.25 per pound for fresh-picked fruit, unsorted, delivered to a central point in Missoula. Gwen Lacefield said she would call back the following morning. She called back that same evening. The deal they made over the phone in June of 1995 was simple. Gwen would take everything Della could deliver for the first 3 years at $4.25 a pound. If the quality held and the relationship held, they would renegotiate in year 4. Della had done the math before she picked up the phone. 300 pounds in year 1 at $4.25 was $1,275. By year 4, if the planting reached its projected yield, it was $10,000 or more. She wrote the numbers in the ledger. She wrote them in the reasons column. She did not tell anyone. She told Cody. She showed him the numbers. He looked at them for a long time without speaking. Mom, yeah, this works. It's going to work. He nodded. He went back outside to finish the evening feeding. He was 18 years old and in his second year of taking the winter feeding route before Della was up in the mornings. He had become the kind of young man who does the hardest thing first and doesn't mention it. The years 1994 and 1995 were the thin years for the cattle operation. Calf prices hit $62 per hundredweight in the fall of 1994, the lowest Della had seen. And she had made the decision in October of 1994 to reduce the cow herd from 180 to 140 head by selling the oldest cows at the Chinook auction rather than carrying them through another winter at a loss. She had told Amos the numbers. They had sat at his kitchen table in the small house at the back of the property, and she had laid out the ledger page in front of him, and he had looked at it without speaking for a long time. Della, he had said finally, I know. The elderberry. It's 3 years from meaningful revenue. Maybe 4. I have 2 years of operating the reserves left at this burn rate. He had looked at his hands. Your mother's mother, he said, used to say that the river ground was the best ground and the worst ground at the same time. The best because nothing grew like it grew along the water. The worst because the river could take it back whenever it wanted to. I'm not losing the river ground, Amos. No, I don't think you are. He had walked her back to the main house. He had not said anything more about the finances. The first commercial harvest came on the morning of September 11th, 1995. Della and Wren and Cody, they picked from 5 in the morning until noon. They worked the rows from the east end toward the river, cutting the fruit clusters into 5-gallon buckets and then weighing them on the postal scale. Della had set up on the tailgate of the pickup. The harvest came in at 448 pounds. Della loaded the buckets into ice-lined coolers. Cody drove the truck to Missoula, 6 hours south and west, arriving at Gwen Lacefield's processing facility, a converted garage behind her house in the South Hills neighborhood, in the early evening. Gwen Lacefield weighed the load herself. She handed Cody a check for $1,903. He drove home overnight. He put the check on the kitchen counter before Della was awake. She found it at 5:15 in the morning when she came down to start the coffee. She stood in the kitchen in the half-dark and looked at it for a moment. Then she put it in the kitchen drawer next to the composition notebook and went out to start the morning feeding. The cattle operation was, through 1995 and into 1996, on margins that required Della to be right about every decision. The herd was at 140 cows. The lease costs on the river pasture were holding, but the deeded ground taxes had gone up. She was drawing against reserves at a slower rate than she had been in 1994, but she was still drawing. She had calculated the runway, 18 months at the current rate, maybe 24, if winter was mild and she didn't lose any calves. The elderberry was not yet saving the ranch. It was beginning to change the math. By the September harvest of 1996, the planting had matured to the point where the largest shrubs along the river were carrying full canopies, 8 feet tall, and the fruit clusters were heavier than anything Della had seen in her 2 previous harvests. She and Wren and Cody picked 1,140 pounds over 4 days. Cody drove 2 loads to Missoula. Gwen Lacefield had added 2 other health food accounts in western Montana and was buying everything Della could deliver. The harvest check for 1996 was $4,845. Della put the check in the kitchen drawer. She did not make any announcements. She wrote the number in the ledger. She wrote it in a column she had never needed before, labeled Revenue, Non-Cattle. Wren was 14 by the fall of 1996. She had, in the way of certain children who grow up alongside a thing from its beginning, developed a kind of personal relationship with the elderberry planting that no one else in the family quite shared. She knew each section of the rows by its individual character. Which canes ran heavy in wet years and which ran consistent in dry, where the fruit ripened earliest and where it needed another week. She had begun keeping her own small notebook, separate from Della's, with the kind of careful observation that she could not yet have named as scientific, but that was exactly that. She had also been writing to Dr. Ossie. She had written her first letter in the spring of 1995, a careful 2-page letter on notebook paper that she had not shown Della before mailing, asking about the difference between Sambucus canadensis and Sambucus nigra, and whether the European variety had different medicinal properties than the American. Dr. Ossie had written back a 4-page letter on university letterhead that Wren had read so many times the paper had softened along the fold lines. Della had found out about the correspondence in the fall of 1996 when she came across one of Dr. Ossie's letters on the kitchen table. She had read it. She had put it back. She had not said anything to Wren about it. She had simply noted, with a kind of quiet satisfaction she kept entirely to herself, that her daughter had found her own way toward the thing. By the spring of 1997, the cattle market had begun to recover. Calf prices had moved back to $74 per hundredweight. The herd was rebuilding, the river pasture. The section behind the elderberry planting had, exactly as Dr. Ossie had predicted, begun to reclaim ground from the bank erosion. The root mass of the mature elderberry had held the bank through 2 spring floods, and the deposition of sediment upstream had begun to rebuild the pasture edge at a rate of approximately 4 feet per year. Della walked the bank line in April of 1997 and found that the ground she had been losing since 1983 had stopped moving, and in some sections had begun to come back. She wrote that in the composition notebook. She underlined it twice. By 1998, the ranch was financially stable. For the first time since Marcus had died, the cattle operation was profitable. The elderberry was generating $7,200 annually and growing. Cody had finished high school and declined a full scholarship to Montana State that Della had not known he'd applied for until the letter arrived. He had left the envelope on the kitchen counter with a note that said, simply, "I'm staying." She had called him in from the shop where he was welding a gate latch and told him that declining the scholarship was his decision to make, and that whatever he decided she would support. He had said he'd already decided. He was 21, and he walked the way his father had walked, with the same unhurried certainty, and Della found that watching him was sometimes something close to grief, and sometimes something close to grace. Wren had decided differently. She had applied to the University of Montana in Missoula and had been accepted into the Environmental Studies program. She had told Della in November of 1997, sitting at the kitchen table after supper, with the calm directness of someone who has been rehearsing the conversation for weeks. "Mom, I want to go to Missoula. I know. You're not surprised. I've known since you started writing to Dr. Osei." Wren had looked at her for a moment. "The elderberry goes with me," she said. "I mean, what I know about it. I want to keep working on it. With Dr. Osei, there are things we don't know yet about the native varieties in this drainage. Take what you know," Della said. "It belongs to you as much as anyone." Wren went to Missoula in August of 1998. She came home for every harvest, every year, without being asked. She came home in December and in April. She drove the 6 hours in her own truck, which she had bought with harvest earnings, and she walked the elderberry rows with Della on the morning after she arrived every time, before she unpacked or slept or did anything else. By the year 2000, the Corwin operation had become something the county had not seen before. A working cattle ranch with a secondary revenue stream from native plant production that was, by every financial measure, outperforming the alternatives. Theron Purcell stopped at the gate on a September afternoon in 2000 and watched Della and 2 seasonal harvest workers. She had hired her first outside help that year, loading elderberry coolers into the truck for the Missoula run. The shrubs behind them were 10 feet tall along the riverbank. July. They were dense enough to break the morning wind off the water. The cattle that grazed the adjacent pasture in early morning were spending their midday hours in the shade at the shrub line, lying down in the way cattle lie down when they are not stressed. Theron sat in his truck for a while. He had a good view of what had happened to the Corwin River pasture from where he was sitting. The bank was solid. The ground behind it was green in September, in a way it had not been green for 20 years. There were customers, 2 cars with Missoula plates, 1 with Washington state plates, parked at the farm stand. Della had set up, at the end of the drive the previous year, a simple wooden table under a canvas roof with hand-lettered signs for fresh elderberry and elderberry jelly, the jelly being Wren's project and Wren's recipe, adapted from a piece of paper Amos had found in a box of old Hester family papers that had been in the back of his storage shed since 1978. Theron got out of the truck. He walked up the drive. Della saw him coming and walked over to meet him. "Della, Theron." He took his hat off. He held it in both hands in the way that men hold their hats when they're about to say something they've been holding a long time. "I owe you a conversation," he said. "You don't owe me anything, Theron." "I think I do." He looked at the riverbank. He looked at the shrubs. He looked at the customers at the farm stand. "I pulled into your drive in 1993 and looked at what you were doing, and I went home and told my wife it was a shame what grief could do to a person's judgment. I said that to my wife, and I said it other places too, and I shouldn't have. What I was actually looking at was someone doing a harder thing than I've ever done in my life." He put his hat back on. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," he said. "I'm asking if I can buy a jar of that jelly before they're sold out." She sold him 3 jars. He came back the following weekend with Arlene Voigt and 2 other ranchers from the north end of the county. He came back the weekend after that without anyone, on his own, and spent 2 hours walking the elderberry rows with Della and asking questions about establishment, about harvest timing, about whether the shrubs would hold up on a drier benchland site if he tried a small planting on his own place. She answered every question. She gave him Dr. Osei's contact information. She gave him a copy of the research bulletin she had been carrying in the kitchen drawer since 1992. The community came back, the way communities always come back. Not all at once, not with any announcement, but in small individual acts that accumulated over years into something that looked, from a distance, like acceptance. Phil Eckerd never came back. He sold his operation in 2001 to a neighbor and moved to Arizona, and Della did not miss his presence on the county road. Arlene Voigt became, by 2003, one of the operation's most consistent defenders at extension meetings, not because Della asked her to, but because Arlene had watched long enough to understand what she'd been looking at. Wren graduated from the University of Montana in May of 2002 and came home. She had written her senior thesis on the commercial potential of native Sambucus canadensis in riparian restoration contexts, with the Corwin operation as the primary case study. Dr. Ossie had driven from Minneapolis for the defense. She had sat in the front row of the seminar room and asked the sharpest questions of anyone on the panel. Wren had answered every one of them. Wren came home and married a man from the Flathead Valley named Derek Stannard in 2004. Derek was a hydrologist who had come to the Milk River drainage to do groundwater monitoring work for the state, and had found the Corwin place through Wren's thesis, which was by then circulating in natural resource management circles in Montana and Wyoming, as an example of what native plant integration could accomplish in a working ranch context. He moved to the ranch. He built He built a small water monitoring station on the bank below the elderberry planting as a component of his state contract work, which meant that the Corwin River property was now part of the long-term hydrological record of the Milk River drainage, which meant that the bank stabilization Della had achieved between 1993 and 2000 would be documented in state water records indefinitely. Cody married in 2005 a woman named Beth who had grown up on a sheep operation outside of Malta, and who had strong opinions about grazing management and even stronger opinions about fencing. She moved to the ranch. She and Cody had taken over the daily management of the cattle by 2006. Della had moved into the smaller house at the back of the property, the one that had been Amos's, after Amos died quietly in his sleep in January of 2005 at age 84. His funeral had been at the Lutheran Church in Harlem. Theron Purcell had spoken. He had read from Psalm 90. His voice had broken at the verse about the work of our hands. By 2010, the Corwin elderberry operation was the largest commercial native elderberry planting in the state of Montana. It covered 11 acres along 3 fence lines on the property. The annual revenue had passed $38,000. The operation was supplying 12 buyers across Montana, Wyoming, and the Pacific Northwest, including 2 craft distillers who were using Corwin elderberry in a limited production elderflower liqueur that had won a regional spirits award in 2009. Gwen Lacefield had retired in 2007, but not before driving to Blaine County with her daughter to see the planting she had been buying from for 12 years. She had walked the rows with Della on a September morning during harvest, and had said, standing at the riverbank with the fruit clusters hanging purple-black around them, that she had been buying elderberry from 3 continents when she first called Della in 1995, and that the Corwin fruit was better than all of it, and she had never understood why until she stood in the drainage where it had grown wild for 10,000 years and felt the river air. Della had not responded to that. She had handed Gwen a pair of harvest gloves, and they had picked together until noon. Dr. Pamela Ossie had retired from the University of Minnesota Extension in 2008, but had continued her research independently and had published a final monograph in 2011 that documented, among other case studies, the 20-year trajectory of the Corwin operation from its 1993 planting through the 2010 harvest season. The monograph had been adopted as a teaching text in 3 university agroforestry programs. A copy of it sat in Della's kitchen drawer next to the original 1992 research bulletin and the composition notebook she had started in the spring of 1993. Della continued to walk the elderberry rows every September morning through 2020, when she was 68. By then, it was her granddaughter, Iris, who walked with her, Ren and Derek's eldest, born in 2007, who had been asking questions about the elderberry since she was 5 years old, and who had been helping with the harvest since she was 7. Iris was 13 in the fall of 2020, and she walked the rows the way Della had trained her to walk them, slowly reading the canes the way the land teaches you to read if you stay long enough. Grandma, yes, the ones at the east end, the new growth at the base. Della looked. The new cane growth at the base of the oldest shrubs, the ones planted in 1993, now 27 years in the ground, was thick and vigorous, the sign of a root system that was not declining but expanding. "They're not old," Iris said. "They just look old." "They're not old," Della agreed. "They're established. There's a difference." Iris wrote something in the notebook she'd been carrying since Della gave her one in the summer of 2019. It was the same kind of notebook, a simple composition book, black cover, college-ruled, that Della had been keeping since 1993, that Dr. Osi had sent her back annotated in 1997, that Ren had kept her own version of since she was 11. The planting covered 12 acres now. The canes along the original South Bank section were 15 feet tall. The stream bank behind them was not the same bank it had been in 1993. It was 3 feet higher and 12 feet wider than it had been the year. Della had bought the cuttings from a Missouri nursery and driven home through a late March snow with the boxes in the back of the pickup. The county had changed too, in ways Della had not predicted and would not have claimed credit for. There were 4 other elderberry operations in Blaine County by 2020. All of them started after 2005, all of them with cuttings propagated from the Corwin stock. All of them selling into the same health food and craft beverage markets that Della had helped open by being the first. Third, it was a dry July. Theron Purcell's operation, the first one anyone had asked her about, had been producing since 2009 and was running 50% of its acreage in native shrubs alongside the cattle by 2020. He called her every September to compare harvest weights. He had called her every September since 2001, and she had always picked up. In the fall of 2020, Iris asked her the question that Ren had never quite thought to ask. "Grandma, the thing Amos told you about the Hesters, the elderberry along their creek. Do you think there are other things like that? Things the old families grew that nobody remembers now?" Della was quiet. They were standing at the east end of the original 1993 row. The morning light was coming off the river in the flat golden way it came in September. The fruit clusters were heavy and ready and smelled of something between dark fruit and green water. She thought about the question for a long time. "Iris," she finally said, "I have been wondering that since the morning Amos told me about your great-great-grandmother's elderberry stand, which was the same morning I put the cuttings in the mudroom and thought I was doing something no one in this county had ever done." They walked back toward the house in the September light. The people who had laughed at the berry patch in 1993 had not been laughing at elderberry. They had been laughing at the unfamiliar. They had been laughing at a woman making a decision they could not immediately categorize in a landscape they thought they knew completely, in a season when the easiest thing to do with grief is to mistake it for recklessness. What they had not understood what Della had understood only slowly herself. Over years of September harvests and composition notebooks and letters from Minneapolis and cold drives through the dark to Missoula, was that the unfamiliar thing was in fact the oldest thing on the land. The elderberry had been growing along the Milk River before there was a county to have opinions about it. The knowledge of how to grow it, how to harvest it, how to turn it into medicine and food, and something worth passing on, had lived in this landscape for longer than anyone standing in the Heckman's parking lot in 1993 had been alive. The knowledge had been forgotten the way all practical knowledge gets forgotten, not all at once, not by decision, but by the slow accumulation of reasons not to need it anymore, until one morning the reason to need it comes back, and the knowledge has to be found again, the hard way, in a research bulletin and a phone call. And 439 elderberry cuttings, planted by a widow and her daughter along a riverbank in the spring of a bad year. Della Corwin had found it. She had planted it. She had waited. The waiting had been the hardest part, and also, she had come to understand, the most necessary part. You could not hurry the root system. You could not hurry the fruit. You could not hurry the moment when the community that had laughed finally drove past slowly enough to see what was actually there. You could only plant and tend and come back every September morning and let the river do the rest.